Welcome to the Jewish Drinking Show, the number one podcast for drinking in Jewish wisdom, history, tradition, and more. Welcome to the 104th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guests to this show, Yamit and Dr. Alon Kol.
Great to be here. Very excited.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. All right. For those who may not be familiar with the Kols here, they have been living in Washington Heights in New York City since 2006, where I met them. They are members of Mount Sinai Jewish Center, where they have served as trustees for a combined 8 terms from 2014 through the present. Yamit, who is an LMSW, has worked in social services since 2005. She's been in practice as a licensed master social worker since 2012 and is currently the program director for geriatric mental health clinics at JASA. Alon, DPM, has been in practice as a podiatrist since 2009 and is currently attending at NYC H&H Bellevue Hospital. They enjoy spending time with Hondo. They're retired racing greyhound, cooking and cocktail making, watching Jeopardy, meditation, the great courses, Call of Duty, photography, playing guitar, urban indoor farming, yoga, boxing, travel, and scuba diving. So that's a lot.
All of that is true. I wish we could do those things more, but yeah.
That's great. I did notice that cocktail making was in there. Do you have a favorite either cocktail or a suite of cocktails that you prefer making?
That's a great question. So I got into cocktail making. So it was me mostly.
Yeah,
I got into cocktail making, getting like really inspired by piling up of, I would say, B-list liquors that people either bring you or, that just are used for various, huge parties or whatever, weddings, bar mitzvahs, and so on, that they're not so high quality that it would be, sad to mix them with other things, but when you if you do mix them with a bunch of other good stuff, then they become quite salvageable.
That's very practical. That's very practical.
It was all totally practical.
And we really wanted to buy new liquor, and Yamit is big stickler. Is like, if you open a bottle, you need to finish the bottle. So before we get new stuff, it's reasonable.
Are there ones that you prefer making, that you like making?
For myself, I don't know, just a regular day. I actually love like something simple, like a gin and tonic. During the pandemic, I would say we drank a lot of bourbon and ginger ale.
Oh, yes. Bourbon and ginger ale, the way to get through a pandemic. Also a way to get an ulcer and a serious drinking problem, but it was a great way to get.
Speaking of drinking, are you drinking anything this evening?
We did make a Bloody Mary.
Ooh, wow. It's a nice garnish on top too.
Thank you. Yeah. We made a Bloody Mary. We thought it was going to be appropriate for tonight's topic.
It is very appropriate.
So, are you drinking anything, Drew?
Just seltzer. I don't usually drink on Sunday evenings, but my palate's with you.
All right. Well,
but yes, you definitely came prepared for it's very it's on brand, it's on theme for our topic of this episode. So the reason that the Kols are here is that they have been serving as premarital preparation teachers, Chatan and Kallah teachers, since 2015 after taking the Chatan and Kallah teacher training workshop. In their capacity as premarital preparation teachers, they discuss, Alon and Yamit, what do you discuss sort of at a broad overview with the engaged brides and grooms that you teach?
Well, I would say we spend about 8 hours with couples that we teach, and we cover a broad range of topics. Typical things that you might think about might be helpful in preparing for marriage, like communication exercises. We have a lot of fun doing I statements and reflections. It's one of the highlights of the course, I got to tell you. We talk about strategies for a healthy sexual relationship in a long-term relationship. And then also we cover certain topics in Jewish law that relate specifically to marriage. So, and mostly specifically relate to sex in marriage, sexual activity. And and anything, and basically, what does halacha say about sex in marriage? What does Jewish law say about sex in marriage?
Yeah.
So for both of us and a lot of our students, we had come from like a fairly traditional yeshiva day school background when we were ready to get married.
Mhm.
And when you come from that sort of background, you start to think as a young person going through that, you would think that Judaism has a very oppressive or punitive view around sex because premarital sex is very much discouraged. But then come to find out that once you're married, Judaism's view on sex is like totally different. Like totally different. That's another one of the highlights of the course. That come to find, like, a lot of people, it's like a really mind-opening moment in the course for a lot of people, that people don't realize that sex in marriage is a mitzvah. That it's one of the commandments. It's a mitzvah d'oraita. It's
People
a
don't
biblical
realize
commandment. People don't, if you haven't thought about it, right? And so that's one of the reasons for the premarital courses, because these things aren't talked about really before you're ready to get married.
Wow.
But it's even more so, right? It's not just that it's a positive commandment. It's also a negative commandment to not do it. Right? So there's two there, right? There's two different commandments there to violate. And when people don't even understand that, when you talk about matzah, right? For example, it's the same thing. It's exactly the same level of problem.
Right.
And people are like, whoa, what? Like, we have to have sex? Yes, you have to. It's required.
Like
if only if you want to
eat matzah on Pesach.
Right.
We hear from other teachers that, what they're hearing, the people, the ideas that they come with into their classes and their courses, it's a lot of what you might expect from, yeshiva day school. It's you don't get the information and it kind of comes in through bits and pieces. And then you're like, okay, well, that doesn't sound right.
Okay.
So we start the course off with establishing that there is an obligation, that husband and wife or people who are married have an obligation to each other. It's part of the social contract. There is this obligation to fulfill each other's needs sexually, which is really interesting. Then after that, we spend the rest of the course talking about ways in which that gets restricted. So I just want to start out with saying, just for anyone who's not familiar, I want to start out with saying what's not restricted. There's no sex act and there's no sexual position that's restricted by Jewish law. That, because there's a lot of like rumors and hearsay about that. So I just want to really clarify that that's one of the things we teach off the top, right? So that's not it.
Does that blow anybody's mind? Like when you're
everyone's mind
constantly. So so we want to really clarify there's no sexual act and no sexual position that's restricted. What is restricted is sexual activity during and for some time after a woman's menstrual period. Thus,
Yummy, like, appropriately dressed for this in red and has her Bloody Mary at the ready.
That's the Bloody Mary.
On theme. So yes, and we could say there's sort of different levels of because at the this comes from the book of Leviticus for listeners who may be entirely unfamiliar with this. And I know that most American Jews, I think, are entirely unaware of these practices. Back when I was in Orange County at the Moishi House, I did a menstruation and I think we did drinks or something. They had Bloody Marys, they had Twizzlers, they had all sorts of red themed stuff, and their minds were blown that these things even existed, that Niddah existed in Jewish stuff. Like it was so new. So at the very least, you're right, sex is totally off limits, but even touch. But we also have even beyond that. It's not just touching, but there are other practices, and that will, I'm trying to go for a segue here. Some of these practices involve drinking.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So when a woman has her menstrual period and is trying to establish that she no longer has her period, right, during that time, like you said, it's not just sexual intercourse between the couple that's not done, but there's the verse actually says, the verse in the Torah actually says, a menstruant woman do not come close to having sex with her. So what does that mean, not to come close? And we have lots of fascinating conversations with our students about like what that means to you and what, you know, and how that can be very individual, right? And like how it can be a challenge to hear about what that meant to a bunch of rabbis in the Middle Ages, or, you know, or even a little bit later. You know, what does that mean, right? What does that mean not to come close?
Yeah.
So that's where we get into. So in the Talmud.
Well, and so in order to not come close, they come up with ways to distance, right? So that they call they're called Harchakot, or distancings. I guess is that the way to say it in English? Distancings.
Harchakot. Yeah, pretty much.
Separation activities.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
What do you think?
I mean, you guys got the two options.
I think that's about it.
Those are fair translations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, Drew, what you're referring to is in the Talmud, the rabbis in the Talmud, as they do, start to list things out. Well, okay, so in order to do this properly, like here's how you do this.
Hey there, I wanted to see how you're enjoying the episode so far. If you have any feedback, comments, questions, anything, please let me know. And also, if you have topics as well as potential guests, including, who knows, maybe yourself, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show.
There are three things that perhaps in Talmudic times that a wife does for her husband in that culture. That when she's menstruating, she should not do. And I think that's what you're referring to. So it's three things. It's mizigat hakos, which is preparing his cup,
mixing his wine,
which is understood to mean mixing wine, which is a whole other, like, that's a cultural reference that we can't even relate to. Like, what does that even mean, mixing wine? So we talk about that. Mixing wine, washing his face, hands, and feet, and making his bed.
Yeah,
I miss the good old days.
Right?
Yeah. So that goes back to Talmudic times, right?
Yeah.
I was thinking like that's one of the paradigmatic, you know, that set of three examples, and drinking's right there.
Right. It's right there.
Yeah.
It's right there because I guess that's like a really important part of life.
Well, it's like a really important part of Jewish life, right? Whenever we want to celebrate, blessings are over wine. Right. That's what the way we say something is important is we're like, here's wine. That's obviously important now.
That's interesting because those things I wouldn't necessarily think of necessarily being like, we need to not do this because otherwise who knows what's going to happen between the two of us.
Right.
I mean, the setting the bed, I mean, he may not even be around. Washing, mixing his cup. Maybe he may or may not be close. She could be off 10 feet away. I don't really exactly know how that happens. Washing his body, the hands, feet, whatever. So she has to be close, but I don't.
That sounds pretty intimate.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah. But again, right. So we talk about how like what's mentioned in the Gemara might not be what everybody can relate to as what they consider something intimate, like foreplay, like, that might lead to sexual intercourse.
Right. It's kind of like the joke that we talk about these days. Like we can't have dancing, like why can't you have dancing? Because you never know what it can lead to. But right. Or mixed dancing.
But Drew, you made a really good point that you can actually start to chip away at these, and the Gemara actually starts to, so after they start to actually backpedal on them. So they put these three things out there, and then they say, oh, well, if she's doing the hard labor of making the bed, like not just fluffing the pillows and putting a mint on it, but like actually like moving the mattress and changing that, and he's not there, even if he knows that she's doing it, that's okay, right? So they start to chip away at it. And with the mixing the wine, right? So I guess I wasn't there, but I guess what I understand is that at the time, wine was sold like very concentrated, and it needed to be watered down.
So they did typically dilute it. And I think it was really just to make it really, they probably the same, it was the same like volume of alcohol as our wine. But in the Roman cultures, what they did is it was like 3 parts to 1. So they would heavily water it down, but they would drink it all throughout the day. So it's not like the way, if you have a few glasses at lunch, for them, That's like maybe one for our
The
time.
equivalent of one.
Right.
Got it.
Because how safe was their water? It's not like they had a bunch of, no, seriously, like they really didn't
No,
have
their
safe.
water was actually really safe.
Only people who wanted to get drunk didn't dilute their wine.
Got it. Okay, there you go. So like I've seen people modern times make the analogy from that to making cocktails. Like if you're making cocktails, you might not want to do that for your husband when you're menstruating. I don't see it in the sources, but I've heard that people, do that practice.
That makes sense.
It makes sense,
Mhm.
like logically, I guess. But even in the Gemara, they sort of chip away at it. They said, okay, well, if she makes his wine, but then serves it to him with her left hand, that could be sort of understandable. Okay, we can make an allowance for that, right? So they start to chip away at, they set these really high bars, and then they're like, well, the point is just that there should be one less level of intimacy. There should be some marker. There should be some recognizable marker that she's not trying to be intimate with him.
And then
Let's
they
not
can't
give
be
all
in.
the credit to the rabbis on that particular point. So that's one of the really good and important parts.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode so far, featuring Yamit and Dr. Alon Kol. I want to give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Dan Rabinowitz.
You can come up with a cocktail and, you do it at home and maybe you batch it. So maybe you make it, 5 times or 6 times the amount or 10 times the amount, but then translating that into hundreds of bottles, you can't just take the recipe and then, just multiply that out.
I hope you enjoy that sneak peek into next week's episode, which I hope you come back for. Now back into this episode featuring Yamit and Dr. Alon Kol.
Something you mentioned earlier was about something recognizable that they cannot be intimate. And that brings me to another thing, which is another harchakot, another distancing that we have is when man and wife are eating and drinking together, that they have to have something that's recognizable that sort of signifies that this is not a time that they are to be together, right?
Right. So if they normally, the way it's written, if they normally eat off the same plate, they would eat off of separate plates. And if they normally eat off of separate plates, but on the same tablecloth, then they would need separate tablecloths. And whatever it is they normally do, they need one extra layer of separation.
Yeah. One other one.
And they're not to eat each other's leftovers either.
Yes. So, I mean, could she drink from his cup?
I think that, yes, right. She can have his leftovers if he doesn't see her doing it, but he can't have her.
Right. So he can't have her. And the leftovers is not just food, but it's
Also
drinking.
Yeah.
Right. So
Also
her cup of whatever it is, he can't then go and drink from the rest of her cup.
But he can't say like, oh, honey, are you done with that? That's too intimate. Even if she walked away. Mm-hmm.
So I just want to point out for the listeners, these are a few key instances of drinking distancings, right, during a woman's menstrual impurity time, her Niddah time. So these are very clear drinking instances.
Yeah.
So for people who may be less familiar with this, or maybe they haven't, maybe who knows, maybe they're still single, maybe they haven't got married yet. What would you describe as some other, I don't know, salient distancings, Harchakot, that you teach about? Are there any other drinking? That's it for drinking ones, right?
I think that's it for drinking ones.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it for drinking. But I think a popular one, if people haven't heard of it before, or they've heard of it, but they didn't know why, was the airplane sagas that normally happen where you have ultra-Orthodox men who cannot sit next to a woman or a wife or any woman, to be fair. And, because of this actual restriction, this goes to the concept of what's called a safsal mitnadned, a swinging seat. So you imagine like one of those swinging seats on a porch, a love seat, something like that. That's kind of what they're referring to. And that gets extrapolated out from that concept into any kind of travel, whether it be in a car or on a plane or anything like that, where you are somehow connected to one another. That is considered an issue, and they need to try to separate in some way during that time. If you are traveling for pleasure. If you're traveling for business, that's fine. If you're traveling for something that is required, it changes the game to some degree, if I understood it correct.
Cool. Yeah. Cool. Are there, either other salient Harchakot that you teach about that you think listeners would like to hear? Also, any that are particularly people have been surprised by?
I mean,
The baby.
that's what I was going to bring up.
baby.
Yeah. That, right. So it's basically understood by the Rishon in the medieval exegesis that it's biblically prohibited to touch at all. Later sources extended this to throwing. So even like tossing the car keys, for example, you wouldn't do that. You have to actually put it down and the other person come and pick it up. The great example of this is a baby, right? So you definitely can't. Oh, the other extension is passing. You can't pass things from one to the other. So that comes up with drinking too, like passing a glass over, or even passing the car keys or passing even a baby, right? So you like if you have a newborn baby and the husband and husband and wife that are presumably the mother and father of this child can't freely pass this newborn baby from one to another. One actually has to put them down and the other one come pick it up. And a lot of people like really, they're like, really? Like, really?
No, the funny part is that normally it's like we say that and they're like, they usually make the joke, okay, then we'll throw the baby. And we're like, no, they got you on that one too.
Yeah. Any other key ones that I guess that's the biggest surprise to people, the not passing or throwing of things, babies. Yeah.
People struggle with this. Like
the beds is a classic one as well.
That's the big one.
Do you want to explain?
Separate beds, separate beds.
Yeah. When you were a kid, separate beds were fun. When you're an adult, separate beds are not fun.
Yeah.
But basically, yeah, that's the point, right? You have two beds next to each other. They have to be separated in some way. There has to be a separation. And, just like with the other Harchakot, every time we start telling them the explanation in good, Jewish fashion, they sit there and they go, okay, I got an idea. This is how we get around it, right? And we're like, now they got you on that one too. Because they were like, okay, well, to put two twins on top of one king box frame. And then I'm like, oh, that was a good one. Yeah, they thought of that a couple of 100 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's always entertaining to see this. Like, every time everyone has a workaround. They're like, oh, we can figure it out.
That isn't easy.
However, if you happen to have a broadsword, that might help.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in again, and if you have ideas beyond the show, beyond the podcast, beyond this video content, if you have ideas for what Jewish drinking can bring you, whether it's, who knows, maybe it's Zoom sessions, maybe it's events, maybe, who knows, swag, please let me know. I'm very curious to hear from you any ideas, things that we can do, things that I can bring you from Jewish drinking. So feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. I'm happy to bring that to you. All right, now back into the show.
I think it's really important with that, if you're going to kind of close out that topic, to really understand that Harchakot is something that in studies it has been found is an area where there's a great deal of variance
in practice.
Oh, okay.
And we want to be clear with what we're saying. We do not recommend this. We're not saying that the people who taught us in any way recommended this. This is not what we are trying to say in any way, to be very clear. But the realities are, it's a very private set of rules, right? And people are doing this within their home, right? No one else knows what's going on. So the variance that is there comes from people actually looking at the halachot and going, okay, well, what's the real core here? What's the point of these harchakot? I don't necessarily care if you're pouring me wine, right? It's not necessarily the thing that's going to, get my engines going. However, if you happen to touch my shoulder like that, well, now it's on. So understanding really the point there is not, all these things, while it is very important, and those are the halachot, and that's what you have to do. But really, if it's something, be intellectually honest with yourself and say, if this is something that could bring me to that place, those are the things that I should definitely be careful about. And we find that that's what people end up doing.
That's really neat. Well, thank you for sharing. So Yamit and Alon, how did you get involved with the workshop and deciding to teach this material?
Well, we actually got involved with this because of the people who taught us.
When we got married, we learned with Ben and Julie Sandler.
Oh, that's who I had.
Huh?
That's who I had. We went to.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we went to, I think it was Drisha.
At
Yeah,
Drisha.
at Drisha.
Oh, cool. So we
Yeah.
did the same. Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah,
See? So, but we were really inspired by that.
Oh, really?
So it took us a few years to come back around to it. But we they've done it every 3 years, this Chatan and Kallah teacher training, and it's run, at least at that time it was run jointly by Yeshivat Chobavei Torah and Jofa, and I think at that time Yeshivat Maharat as well. And it's designed and it's co-taught by a sex therapist and a Rosh Yeshiva, because that's like, you know, and so just that combination is just great. And I believe it was the third cohort that they did was the first time that they allowed men in the course. It had previously only been for women.
Really? Oh, wow.
yeah,
Huh.
yeah, that's right. Woo!
I'm
Breaking
surprised they didn't
barriers. I
involve
broke the
men.
glass ceiling.
Yeah, I'm surprised they didn't involve men earlier. What you said there was something that appealed to you. What was there something in particular that appealed to you? Was it just having that mix, that it wasn't just Rabbi Linzer?
And we were really inspired by the Sandlers, who were teaching this as a couple to couples. And we really jumped on it when we saw that it was an opportunity to learn this material together as a couple and teach. And we've done a little bit of teaching separately, but we've really specialized in couples together as a couple.
Yeah, and we think it's incredibly important. If you're going to be in a sexual relationship with someone, you should be able to have the conversation about it. You can't have the conversation, you shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, that's
simple.
That's a good selling point.
Pretty much start out like we go around the room like, okay, everybody say penis, vagina, everyone say penis, vagina. Like you need to be able, like, if you haven't previously said those words to each other, like now's a good time to start. Like,
yeah. So you've been doing this for over a half dozen years. What, I know you said people like freaked out when you were saying that, you know, when you can have sex, anything, you know, everything's, available. What have you had other sort of surprise moments? I know you mentioned also earlier about the not passing the baby aspect. Have there been other things that are just, you know, on the whole, just surprise moments for the attendees? No?
Another eye-opening moment in the course is when we teach about Chumrah Verbizera.
That's a good one. Oh, there's so many good ones. We actually make it a drinking game a lot of the time. All the euphemisms that we hear.
That's really fun. Actually,
that should be for your show now.
Actually, that's how we bring drinking into our course. When
you do? Oh, I didn't even think to ask. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, informally. I mean, you know, it's not required as part of the course, but in the Gemara in particular, there are so many amazing euphemisms for female reproductive organs.
Yeah.
It's a great drinking game. It's excellent.
Okay, let's rephrase that. It's a dangerous drinking game because you can smash like within the first 20 minutes of our class. So yeah, I mean, it has its positives and negatives.
Yeah. That's funny. But maybe the Chumrah de Verbizera, that's a separate conversation. I definitely am. Yes, I'm very curious to have it. But, you know, switching gears, you know, that's, you know, from the student side. But what about for you? You know, what through the over half dozen years that you've been teaching these teaching these couples, what have been, I don't know, for you, I don't know, I want to say more gratifying aspects or elements that, or other things that just have made you feel glad to be involved with this endeavor?
I think more than anything, it's that we find we're like helping them open their lines of communication, whether it's, you know, in their sexual life or it's in their personal life. You know, we've been married, Baruch Hashem, for, you know, for a long time. And, you know, we've had our disagreements, just like any couple can, and most couples will. And if you don't, it's, you know, probably something wrong there.
I was going to say, I think you can't make it this long without having a lot of disagreements.
Right. And I think, you know, with that and both Yamit's background in, you know, mental health, we get this opportunity to really catch people before things go wrong, right? So there's this idea now in general that people do premarital therapy visits, and they go and speak to a therapist ahead of time to help them begin their process of communicating. Communication is the root of all problems between people. And if we get the opportunity to teach them that, both in their regular day-to-day stuff and in their sexual relationship, just think of how many minds we can help them avoid. All those things that we may not have known when we were younger, and we got the opportunity to now teach that to somebody else. That's great. Because that's going to help them, move forward. I think that's probably the most gratifying part of it.
It's to know that we were able to give a couple the common language to talk about these things. We hear, one of the reasons we wanted to get into this is because we hear a lot of horror stories about how couples that learned separately, she learned with somebody and he learned with somebody, they learned different things.
Oh yeah.
Or
wow. And we get these we have sometimes we even get these curbside consults, as it were, because we have friends who are not married yet, and they're talking to people, and they're getting their different information, and they'll be like, well, what do you guys say when this is? And it's interesting to see that there's very big differences, and that friction is not a good place to start, right? You don't want to start a marriage with friction already. There's enough there to cause friction. So the idea that you can actually get ahead of that by just having a common discussion, that everybody's on the same page. That's why we do our teaching together. We don't do it separate, because you have to talk. You have to be able to have these conversations. And having everybody on the same page, learning the same information, is really how you get there. We don't teach anything that we weren't taught, right? We are not Jewish educators. We don't have, degrees in Jewish education. We were taught specific bits of information. The information that was taught to us, though, was taught to us the way I love to learn, which is from the bottom up, right? You learn as far back as you can where these things come from and how they get layered on top of each other. And when you understand that, that's when you can really engage with the ideas, engage with the material, engage with the discussion between each other, because in the end, these are rules that are private. These are things that are done in the home. No one will ever know what you do. So really, it is a moment where people really get to choose how they end up practicing. And that's a discussion you have to have with each other. And that requires the communication, and that requires the understanding of the material, that requires an understanding of the topic. And I feel like when you come at this from that perspective, then you can really kind of digest a lot of it better, because otherwise, when you see this from the higher view, it's very difficult to swallow a lot of these rules.
And one of the things that's really gratifying is when students refer their friends who are getting married to us. When we get referrals from previous students, like, okay, I guess we did something right. And then when we're teaching, when we're doing the communication exercises, like practicing reflections and I statements, when the students start to giggle, but you see that glimmer in their eye, like they're getting it. But the examples are relatable, because obviously even being engaged, even planning a wedding, there's so many minds you can step on.
And we actually get to help them. A lot of times it's actually funny, because we'll be their side therapists, right? Because they'll talk to us, because their families, like all families before a wedding, are 2 or 3 drinks into the wind most of the time. And they are really, having difficult times. And they, we, in our sessions, it ends up being a topic where they bring it and they talk, and they're like, oh man, we have this, we're getting ready to pick the caterer, and and my family thinks we should have, 200 people, and his family thinks we should have 500 people. And we just want 10 people. How do you navigate the discussions? And it all ends up going back to the discussion of communication, but we get to talk to them about it. And it's really very gratifying, because we end up helping them a lot of the time, with these, just things to work out, things that you would expect any normal couple to have.
Yeah.
That's great.
We try to bring humor
Yeah.
and other things that we've learned. No, it's great. We love doing it. We do it because we love doing it. We do it because we're, mission oriented about it. Like Alon said, we're not Jewish educators. This isn't what we do. And we don't mean to take away from anybody who does do this, professionally. We would never want to take away from them. But we do really want to urge people to think really a lot before choosing who you want to learn with. If you're thinking of getting married and you want to, or even not, and you just want to learn more about these rules, and you want to pick a teacher to learn with, to really think a lot about that. And if you are getting married, not to wait until the day before your wedding to start courses.
You're laughing like it's happened.
A little bit of planning.
Are there people who just realize a month or weeks before?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
First of all, you're talking about people who aren't necessarily engaged for that long. They may be engaged for a total of 3 months.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, to be fair, a
Fair.
lot of, the timeline on Jewish engagements can be a little bit shorter than non-Jewish engagements.
Fair.
Usually an anniversary doesn't pass. Usually.
Right. Like from the time they started dating till the time they get married, it could be, that whole thing could be less than a year.
Fair enough.
So, yeah. So don't relegate this to the bottom of the pile. Make sure to include it in your budget. The high quality teacher that you want might be slightly pricier than what you expected.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's clever to include it in the wedding budget is the premarital class. Okay. Yamit and Alon, thank you so much. This is very enlightening, very interesting. And before we go, do you have anything that you would like to share or otherwise pitch?
I mean, you can feel free to get in touch with us for classes. Yeah, our contact information is available. Will be made available, I'm sure, with as you're listening or watching us.
Speaking of remote, if people are not in the New York tri-state area, are they able to, I guess, do by Zoom or however to?
Yeah, no, we've had students outside of the tri-state area before.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. No, we do. I mean, especially during COVID, we've done a lot of remote. But yeah, remote is great. Speaking of COVID, though, I did want to say something.
Yeah.
I just last night we were joking around that how similar the new CDC quarantine guidelines are to Niddah laws.
Wow.
Like you have to, if you get sick with COVID, you have to wait a minimum of 5 days, and then you have to check yourself and test. It's really a lot like Niddah rules. And
That's really amusing.
About that.
That's really amusing.
Yeah, because each time it's an internal. It's good.
Exactly. It's like a really invasive check that you have to do.
That's good. Awesome. All right. With that, thank you so much, Alon and Yamit, and L'chaim.
L'chaim. Good to see you.
L'chaim. Great to see you.